This video is brought to you by my lovely patrons over at Patreon, where just $1 a month will get you access to exclusive content like my deleted videos archive and patron-only live streams. It's been a pretty big week for the leader of the Liberal Democrat Party and Senator David Leyonhjelm.
I told him that he was a creep. His reply was to tell me to F...
David Leyonhjelm's offensive remarks should have been withdrawn the moment they were uttered, and he should have apologised.
I'd like to see Malcolm stop being such a pussy.
I had the opportunity to catch up with the Senator this week to discuss a range of topics. Here's how that conversation went. You've had quite the week. Do you have any regrets about what you said to Sarah?
I don't think so. The issue is what I've always had in mind. So I don't. I have no regrets about the fact that I that I raised it, that I confronted her over what she'd said, and the way I've argued the case.
I'll tell you what I found pretty amazing was when, I think it was the night that you were both on the project, you came on and you said your thing, and then after you'd said your thing, they had her on, and she said something to the effect of, it's an affront to women everywhere. It just struck me as amazing how your comments directly to her could be offensive to women everywhere. Yeah,
that's right. So she's arguing that she never said that all men are rapists. She doesn't believe all men are rapists, and yet over and over again she takes a collective swipe at me on behalf of all men over what I've said. So on the one hand, what I say is supposedly directed at all men, at all women, but what she says has nothing to do with men in general. It's at the very least seriously hypocritical.
The other thing that I found interesting was, as this has happened, never has she said, that's not what I said, this is what I said. It's as if we're almost expected to believe that she didn't say a thing, and you suddenly arced up at her and started talking about shagging men. Now, that's unbelievable.
You're quite right. We've commented on that in the office. We've remarked on the fact that the interviewers have asked her, did you say all men are rapists? And she says no, and then elaborates on that. And not one of them has gone back to her and said, well, what did you say then? The idea that I would yell out to her, stop shagging men then, for no reason at all, just defies belief. So, yeah, I agree. It's an anomaly. The media hasn't been at all, or the mainstream media hasn't been at all sympathetic to me on this issue. That's been very much a lynch mob. They hunt in packs, and people in the media, I mean, there are exceptions to this. There are some really good people, but overwhelmingly they care more about what their colleagues think about them than doing their readers or listeners a service. Yeah. And so, the approval or disapproval of their colleagues influences the way they respond to an issue. And so, even though a good number of them never even heard me interviewed on Outsiders or on 3AW, which is what set the storm off, they've jumped in and criticised me irrespective based on almost no information.
Were you disappointed with the Outsiders' sudden turnaround? I mean, they apologised immediately the next day for not challenging you. I mean, it seems absurd.
Yeah, it is absurd. They invited me on in the first place knowing full well what I was going to discuss. And in fact, I did say to them before I went on, look, I really don't want to go over the details of the exchange with Hanson Young. I'd rather talk about the bigger issues of misandry and the hypocrisy that applies to it relative to misogyny. And they, Rowan Dean said, yes, that's fine. And then, of course, when they got me on the show, they immediately wanted me to rehash what had occurred in the Parliament. So it was their initiative. The other thing is that their concerns after the interview went to air were based on fears that Qantas may pull its sponsorship, because Alan Joyce, of course, is an activist chief executive, and they were worried that there was one of those change.org petitions had been set up seeking Alan Joyce to withdraw Qantas sponsorship of Sky. And apparently, I didn't know this, but apparently Qantas is quite a substantial sponsor of Sky. That was what motivated their original reaction. So my view was, okay, well, they want to save a sponsorship, okay, chuck me under a bus. I'm a big boy, I can cope with it. But then they all just piled on. And, it was just host after host after host was piling on, telling everybody what a terrible person I was. In my view, that wasn't intended to do anything to save Qantas as a sponsor. It was this pack mentality. I've got a bigger stake in the opinions of my peers than I have in whatever principles there might be at stake here.
It was pretty ironic that they're all suddenly out for blood for this misogynistic senator, and it's the 25 or 26-year-old female producer that gets the arse for it.
Oh yeah, that's a really quite a sad thing about it. The producer gets sacrificed, and that's all that happens. Is I think they had to signal. I think they felt they had to signal to Qantas that they were taking it seriously and had done something as a result of it. But and I think that was done, as I said, out of concern over Qantas rather than any matter of principle about what I'd said. But it's very unfortunate somebody in a position really who didn't know what I was going to say, didn't invite me there, had nothing to do with the interview, is the one who pays the price.
I think she did end up getting reinstated, but it's interesting you say that. It pretty much was a big virtue signal, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
I've got a few questions from my audience here. I might go through a few of them if you don't mind. What are your thoughts on? We've had 5 years of Conservative government, yet we're still stuck with something like 18C. Why do you think that is, and do you think there is a genuine appetite there to get rid of it?
Well, it depends who you ask. In some circles, there is a recognition that 18C is a poisonous blot on our legal landscape, that people can be hauled up before courts and tribunals on the basis of somebody's feelings. And the subjective nature of feelings is most of us are only too well aware of that. But on the other hand, there is this view that it's not nice to hurt somebody's feelings, that we all should be kind and sensitive and thoughtful about other people's feelings, and therefore to remove 18C would mean racial or feelings would be hurt on the basis of racial or ethnic actions or comments, and I suppose that's what it amounts to, if I can put a positive gloss on it, and I struggle a little bit at times to do that. There is a feeling that we should be nice to each other, and that because there are some people in the world who aren't nice to other people at times, therefore that's a legitimate reason for the law to get involved. Now, my view is that being nice to each other is a good thing to aim for, but it's not a matter for the law. Niceness and feelings are too subjective, too individually variable for the law to get involved, and it should have nothing to do with it. And as a matter of fact, we have found 23 pieces of legislation already in the law where it is an offence to cause offence to a public official, a government employee of some description. I've actually just introduced a bill to repeal all of the provisions in those 23 acts relating to giving of offence or the taking of offence, however you want to put it, in the case of these government officials. And I mean, the Copyright Tribunal, for example, it's an offence to give offence to an official of the Copyright Tribunal. Who knows whether that individual is a delicate little daffodil or has got a robust self-esteem and thick skin and doesn't get offended. How the hell are you supposed to know that? And it's potentially a criminal offence. And as I said, there are 23 bills or acts we found that needed this provision removed from it. So there is an issue here that governments in the past have, and even still, have felt it necessary to legislate to protect hurt feelings. And 18C is in that category. It's all about hurt feelings. And considering we don't even know what a hurt feeling is, and those of us who feel as if we're responsible for our own feelings believe we can't blame anyone else for them anyway, I think it's completely wrong.
Miss Young must have taken a pretty big punt coming over and calling you a creep then. Who knows what that could have done to your feelings?
Well, indeed, I may have needed counselling or something like that for it, Creep is a pretty creepy word.
Exactly. And you hadn't done anything. You hadn't called her any names prior to that. You'd suggested that she stop shagging men. Now, a mate of mine actually published a video yesterday about this and likened it to, imagine she was standing across the other side of the parliament saying, "I hate all cake." Now, you've simply told her to stop eating cake.
Well, that's right. And it was made in the context of her calling out was the effect that all men are collectively responsible for the rape and murder of that poor young woman in Melbourne. And there was a motion had been presented to the Senate asking or calling for the government to allow non-lethal means of self-defence for women. And the comment was made, I'm pretty sure it was by Sarah Hanson-Young. It's certainly been confirmed by Darren Hinch, that she said men wouldn't need pepper spray. I think was what she said. Women wouldn't need pepper spray if men would stop raping them. Now, some people have said, she wasn't referring to all men, she was only referring to some. But you imagine how that sentence would sound if instead of having men in it, you had blacks or Aborigines or Muslims. Exactly. There would be no question then that it was referring in a collective sense. Now, that's precisely how I interpreted it. And so Sarah is heterosexual. She's divorced. She has boyfriends. This is well known. And so I just sort of thought, okay, this is hypocrisy. If you are blaming men for what you collectively, then why on earth are you fraternising with the enemy? That was the purpose of it all. Perfectly legitimate comment. Shagging is not generally regarded as unparliamentary. I mean, there's lots of other words you could use that would be unparliamentary, but not that one as far as I'm aware. So I didn't regard it as particularly naughty. And then coming and calling me a creep, that is unparliamentary. If that had been heard by the President, she would have had to withdraw it. And then, of course, me telling her to F off, that is totally unparliamentary. And again, if I had been overheard saying that by the President, I would have had to withdraw it. But the initial cause, which is stop shagging men, I'd be surprised if that was regarded as unparliamentary.
What about this claim that you're slut-shaming her? I mean, to my understanding, if Sarah Hanson-Young was to come over to you and say, "Senator, you're a fat c***," it's ridiculous because you're not fat. Don't you have to be something if you're to be shamed for that something?
Yes, I've heard that quite a few times over the last few days. You can only be fat-shamed if you're fat. And so what does that say if I'm slut-shaming her? And I mean, the point is, of course, I was saying nothing about promiscuity or how many men boyfriends she has or anything. I was saying absolutely nothing about that. That's how that's been interpreted, but it's a complete misinterpretation of what I meant. And I don't think even it's even legitimate to take the words that I said and interpret them that way and say, well, you weren't careful enough with your words. I can't see that in it either. What I was pointing out, as I said, was that she said something which would suggest that all men are the enemy, and yet here you are fraternising with the enemy. And I was pointing out, as I said in a number of interviews, double standards or hypocrisy, whatever you want to call it. I think it's a perfectly legitimate point to be made.
you clarified it for her too. You said something to the effect of, well, she can shag as many men as she wants.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I wasn't intending to say she shouldn't or that there's something wrong with what she's doing. What I was seeking to point out was that you've just labelled them all as responsible, and yet you seem to like some of them, at least one or two every now and again. I don't really know her history, but
that's not the point, is it?
That's not the point, no.
Another question someone's put to me. It's a pretty broad one, but this person said, "Why does the senator need to prove that she said these things or it didn't happen? Yet female rape victims that come forward months or years after the incident are supposed to be automatically believed without question."
Yeah, well, I suppose the first part of the question is, why should I have to prove what I said? I don't have to prove what I said.
No, I think it was prove what she said.
What she said. Oh yeah, prove what she said. Yeah. Well, I suppose it was. There was some degree of onus on me to justify why I responded in the way I did. I find it a bit curious that a number of interviewers have said, well, if you can't remember the exact words that she said, therefore she didn't say anything like that, which is it's quite a bizarre approach, and it displays their bias, if you like. But of course, I mean, the truth is violence against women is a serious issue.
I agree.
And so when women lodge a complaint saying they've been raped or sexually assaulted in some other way, I have no hesitation in saying it needs to be taken very seriously, although our legal system has this virtue of innocent until proven guilty. So the police will take a complaint seriously and they'll investigate it, but ultimately they won't prosecute somebody, and somebody, somebody who is prosecuted won't be convicted unless the case can be proven. There is a presumption of innocence in every criminal case. And that's how it should be. You can't go around making idle accusations like that and get away with it. But as I reiterate, nor should we dismiss lightly accusations of sexual assault. That creates an onus on women to not make them frivolously. They need to mean it when they say it, and not just be making stuff up either.
I completely agree. I think what they were referring to was that there seems to be a big push, particularly with young, what we would call progressives, that for some reason, in the case of sexual assault against females, there is to be a presumption of guilt until proven innocent. I think that's at the heart of what he was getting at.
The criminal justice system is a safeguard against the guilty until proven innocent thinking that may be behind that. But what I do find a little alarming is this broadening of the definition of sexual assault. So for some women, thankfully, it is still very much a minority, but for some women, admiring a pretty girl is, if she finds that unwelcome, there are some women who will regard that as sexual assault. And of course, we know it's not, and we also know that a lot of pretty girls don't mind being admired in the least. It's a matter of what else you do that might qualify. If you touch somebody in the wrong place, unwelcome, that may amount to sexual assault. And of course, rape is a very serious sexual assault. But there is this definition of sexual assault that's now creeping in, at least to some universities. And even asking a girl out, asking a girl for a drink or go out for dinner or something like that, if it's not welcome, some women are saying, oh, that amounts to sexual harassment or sexual assault. And of course, we all know that that's not true.
We had the recent flare up of the footballer, his name Barry Hall, making an edgy joke on radio, and we had the comedian Michelle Laurie, pretty edgy comedian herself, come out and admonish dirty jokes. It does next. Can you believe that? A comedian campaigning against telling jokes?
Yeah, I know. Comedians wouldn't have anything to say if they didn't tell dirty jokes. I mean, that's
exactly.
That's the essence of being a comedian for most of them, at least. Very, very, very few of them are funny if they didn't have dirty jokes to tell.
That's right. Just going back to 18C, I mean, when Labor does next get in, do you think there's as much chance of them expanding it? I mean, I recall there was some talk about broadening an 18C-like law to include things like sexual identity and gender identity. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there is a possibility of it. This idea that our feelings should be protected by the law does have a level of support amongst mostly the left of politics, the Greens and the left wing of the Labor Party. The Labor Party is a number of parties within a party, so it's by no means unanimous. So whether a Labor government would do anything about that would depend on which mini party within Labor has control over that issue. But you couldn't rule it out. The idea that you're not allowed to give offence on the grounds of something to do with your racial background, your ethnicity or your nationality, it's not a big stretch to then go to saying, well, you shouldn't also give offence on the basis of whether you are gay or straight, black or white, young or old, male or female, all that sort of stuff. Giving offence, we've got to legislate to make people be nice to each other. So you couldn't really rule that possibility out. I find the thought of that abhorrent, quite frankly. But there are people around who would be happy to see that situation.
Would you push for something like America's First Amendment or even Second Amendment, the gun rights laws?
Well, entrenching rights in constitutions is not a guarantee that those rights will be protected. It would need a referendum, of course, to do that, just to pass a law, as Victoria has done, of rights. It really doesn't guarantee that those rights will be protected. They can be overturned by subsequent legislation. America's rights are entrenched in the Constitution. And the downside of them is that they give courts enormous power, enormous authority. And of course, the judges are unelected, so there's not much you can do about them if you don't like their result. You can't vote them out. So at the moment, as in the case of the Second Amendment, the US Supreme Court has been split 5-4 in favour of gun rights. President Trump has increased that ratio now to, I think it's probably 6-3 by now. It might still be 5-4, and then Justice Kennedy has just announced his retirement, and Trump is about to announce a replacement. And one of the key issues is whether it will be a pro-Second Amendment justice. Now, that's one way to deal with it. We, of course, have lost the vast majority of our gun rights in Australia, and some would say that a Second Amendment might have prevented that. But in America, even with the Second Amendment, if Hillary Clinton had won the presidency and she had stacked the Supreme Court with anti-Second Amendment justices, they would have interpreted it in such a way that gun rights would have been seriously infringed anyway. So my feeling is that it doesn't make a whole lot of difference to put this in the hands of judges. If you get a good result, you say, yeah, that's good, but if you get a bad result, there's not much you can do about it. You can't vote them out. I would much rather rely on the democratic process. So if you get a government that says, okay, I'm going to take away all your guns, then we can vote them out if there's enough of us. And there are other countries, democratic countries, without Second Amendments, without Bills of Rights, and New Zealand is a good example. Very free country. In the Freedom Index produced by the Cato Institute, New Zealand is ahead of Australia by 2 or 3 places, and they have pretty reasonable gun laws over there. They still have semi-automatic rifles and shotguns, for example. They don't have this hysterical anti-gun attitude in the media that we cop all the time, and yet they don't have a Bill of Rights. So I think it's possible to achieve the results you want without a Bill of Rights. On free speech, it's much the same. The Supreme Court in the United States has interpreted the First Amendment in the United States in various ways. Sometimes that's positive, so you'll get advertising that some people might find distasteful, or they might find that it advertises a product they don't approve of, that sort of thing. And the Supreme Court has said no, advertising is also speech, so it's protected. But still, they have a fair degree of political correctness in America, and it's not a guarantee that speech will remain out of the hands of the legislature. We do have an implied right of free speech, at least in relation to political speech in Australia, which the High Court has some years ago interpreted in our Constitution. That's not a bad thing. I'm not sure we would improve on that by having it in the Constitution.
A mate of mine, a Scottish mate of mine, who goes by the name Count Dankula, recently had some troubles with the courts over in Scotland relating to his pet pug. Did you hear of that?
Yes, he taught his pug to do a Nazi salute, as I recall.
He did. What did you think of that?
Well, it was ridiculous that he even got prosecuted, let alone convicted. I mean, irony, laughing at things we disagree with, taking the piss out of them, is a perfectly legitimate form of expression, political expression or whatever. Teaching a pug to do a Nazi salute would seem to me a piss take of the first order. Why it should offend against some sort of hate speech law is bewildering. And I have to say, I found that case very disturbing. Has he appealed, by the way?
He is appealing. Yeah, he's just done a fundraiser to launch a pretty strong appeal. He's in his words, he's getting in the big guns. So I think he's hoping to make a pretty big change over there. But I found that case ridiculous because in the end the courts themselves dictated the context. I mean, forget that it was a joke. Forget any of that. It came down to the words and the way that the court interpreted his meaning of those words, which is a joke in itself.
Yes, that's right. And I think it was a magistrate or a first level judge in sitting by himself. My feeling is that higher level courts tend to have better quality judges and more sensible outcomes are delivered. So I'm pleased that he is appealing, because I think there's a fairly good chance that a higher court would look at it and go, this is stupid, don't be silly, get out of here.
Have you been following what's been happening with Tommy Robinson?
Yes, a number of people have encouraged me to get involved in Tommy Robinson's case, or at least take a position on it. And I haven't for one main reason. On the one hand, it is a free speech issue. He has been talking about Islamists and their sexual predation in the UK and the cases surrounding that. On the other hand, there is an issue of contempt of court. Contempt of court is a legitimate issue involving jury trials. I'm not sure whether there was a jury trial involved in this. There's quite a lot of common law on this area. If a jury is influenced by stuff happening outside, then it could prejudice a fair trial. The objective of a trial is to ensure that only evidence accepted by the court as legitimate evidence is presented to the court, and the jury bases its decision, its guilt or innocence, on that evidence that's presented to the court. Other information from outside is supposedly not allowed in because it could contaminate the verdict. Now, judges have historically taken the view that juries are vulnerable to that kind of outside influence, and so they've been pretty hot on contempt. But judges themselves, when it's a judge alone trial, have always taken the view that they're pretty hard-headed guys or women, and they don't really need protecting from outside influences. I'm not sure whether the case on which Tommy Robinson was commenting was a jury trial or a judge trial.
Oh, it was a jury trial.
It was a jury trial, yes, okay. Well, if that's the case, then he was warned that if you speak about this, you'll be in contempt of court. He flouted that. I think he was seeking to go to jail to make a point, and I'm sure he's made that point. But the thing is, if it had led to a mistrial, if the trial had been abandoned because of what he had done, then you could legitimately claim that he had interfered with sending some perpetrators to jail. And I don't think that would be regarded as a good outcome. I have problems with contempt of court laws in this country, in Australia, when they are intended to protect judge-only trials from influence. I don't think that's that's a reasonable aspiration. But juries are a different kettle of fish.
Yeah, I don't think I don't have a problem with the fact that he did push his luck in the fact that he knew that there was a possibility of the contempt of court charge. The issue that I have with it is that alongside Tommy, there were a whole heap of mainstream media, journalists doing the same thing. So it's more of an application of the law type thing, and the fact that he was singled out in particular. Presumably because he's Tommy Robinson and he was, he had the book thrown at him and not the BBC people that were yards from him.
Yes, although I think he was the only one who had been specifically warned not to do it again, as I understand it. And but yes, if you're looking for consistency in the law, you'll often be disappointed though. It seems to be applied inconsistently, and so you end up with inconsistent outcomes, and on the face of it, they're unjust.
On a separate topic, what are your thoughts on video game censorship and media censorship in Australia? Where do you think that will go, and where would you like it to go?
Video game censorship, I've had a bit of involvement with that. Another one of the bills I introduced the week before last was to stop all denials of classification for games and videos, and except when they are inciting or instructing on sexual abuse or terrorism, something like that. So they couldn't be banned just on the basis that they offend somebody. They're against standards, community standards or whatever. Now, having said that, the classification board is relatively sensitive to the sorts of criticisms that I level at them. And they have been moving, much too slowly for my liking, but moving nonetheless in the direction of recognising that adults should be able to play and look at what they like, subject to this there's some sexual things involving children, no instructions on or incitement on terrorism and that sort of stuff, violence. But broadly speaking, adults should be able to see and participate in and view what they like in terms of games and videos, but that we need to protect children. So where there is a lockout system of some description, if you need a PIN or there's some other method by which an adult can keep control of it, and it's not just a matter of banging it on Foxtel, for example, and you can watch it, then that should apply. And to a degree, the classification board is tending towards that. But every now and then, we do get games that are rejected, that they're denied approval of any description. In a couple of cases, I've got involved and they backed off. But I get regular complaints from gamers saying, this should not be prohibited. The classification board has gone over the top, and sort of scratch your head a bit and think, well, what the hell are they thinking? In fairness to them, they do publish their reasons after a while, and so you can see, well, what was the logic behind it? In one case, for example, there was simulated rape, and it was only cartoon characters who were doing it, but still, I could understand why they were arcing up over it.
You made a comment last week about the Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull. You said you'd wish he'd stop being such a pussy. Do you think if Malcolm Turnbull's a pussy, would you think it's fair to say that Bill Shorten's a massive soy boy?
Yes, well, he is. I mean, this idea that only men can be sexists, that if enough women scream about something, irrespective of the merits of a case, a man should apologise. Bill spends his time walking on eggshells, trying to not to upset the female. The female, I don't know what you call them, the activists on his side of politics, who really have never quite forgiven him for being a bloke. And anything that he says is clearly wrong unless they approve of it. So he lives in this weird situation where he can't say boo to a goose, and calling on somebody to apologise is second nature for Bill. But in Malcolm's case, he's also unreasonably sensitive, I think, to this apologise mentality. People have taken offence, irrespective of the merits of whether or not they should have taken offence. Therefore, you should apologise. And saying it to a woman, I mean, women demand equality. They scream their heads off. Well, some of them scream their heads off about the number of women on boards, the number of women chief executives, the number of women represented here, there, and everywhere. Argue for all this diversity, and then when a man says to them, F off, notwithstanding the fact that a woman might say F off, all of a sudden that's grounds for calling for an apology. I mean, if you want to be equal with men, quite a lot of women say, no, we're not equal with men, we're different. But if you want to be equal with men in terms of opportunities and so forth, then you have to have equal opportunity at being insulted or told to F off. You can't expect to be treated like delicate little flowers 1 minute and then expect to be given a preferential treatment, getting all the top jobs at the next minute. It's just not on. That's not how it works.
I think it's amazing as well. I mean, not once have I ever heard demands for equality when it comes to garbage men or steel workers or, yeah.
Well, that's it, precisely. And of course, the men have not started on pushing back against the fact that women overwhelmingly dominate childcare workers, primary school teachers, for example. And why? It's simply because men are falsely accused of being fiddlers, kiddie fiddlers all the time, or their motives are questioned. So they stay away from it. There are good reasons why women stay away from working in steelworks and manufacturing and so forth, because it's heavy, it's dirty, it's dusty, it might be loud. They don't want that. They want the cushy jobs with the big bucks.
Well, I think we've established that Bill Shorten is in fact a soy boy. If you'd pass that along publicly, I'm sure a lot of my audience would appreciate it.
Don't think there's any doubt about that. Yeah.
Fantastic. Look, I think that pretty much wraps us up. Thanks very much for your time, Senator. It's been great.
Okay, you're welcome. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks.